An elderly black man in worn clothes shuffles into Morgan Heights Bank. Clutching a tattered leather bag to his chest, he announces calmly, "This building belongs to me." The bank staff exchange glances, smirking. The branch manager, a sharp-dressed woman, can barely contain her laughter. Security moves closer, but when he opens that weathered bag, everything changes. Their smiles vanish. Papers yellowed by time reveal a truth that will shake the foundation of everything they thought they knew. Sometimes, justice arrives in the most unexpected packages. Have you ever judged someone based solely on their appearance, only to later realize how terribly wrong you were? In Westfield, Connecticut, on a crisp autumn morning, the staff at Morgan Heights Bank faced this exact reckoning when 78-year-old Walter Green walked through their polished glass doors. Walter wasn't dressed like their typical clients. His coat was worn at the elbows, his shoes scuffed from years of use, and he carried a battered leather bag that had seen better decades. When he announced that the land beneath their prestigious building rightfully belonged to him, the immaculately dressed staff couldn't contain their amusement. After all, how could this elderly black man from the poorer side of town possibly have any claim to one of the most valuable properties in the financial district? What happened next would not only change the course of Walter's life, but would force an entire community to confront the prejudices they denied having. This is a story about dignity in the face of dismissal, justice long delayed, and the power of truth to cut through generations of systematic suppression. We live in a society that often celebrates quick judgments, where the way you look, speak, or dress determines how seriously your voice will be heard. For Walter Green, a lifetime of being underestimated had prepared him for this moment, though nothing could prepare the bank staff for what his weathered hands would pull from that old leather bag. Sometimes, history buries truths that are too uncomfortable to acknowledge. Sometimes, documents yellow with age carry the power to right ancient wrongs. And sometimes, the most profound lessons about respect and human dignity come from those we've been conditioned to overlook. I want you to stay with me until the very end of this story, because what transpired that day at Morgan Heights Bank isn't just about property rights or legal documents. It's about recognizing the humanity in each person we encounter, regardless of their appearance or social status. It's about understanding that behind every dismissed elder might be a lifetime of wisdom and untold stories waiting to be heard. Walter Green rose before dawn, as he had done every day for the past 60 years. At 78, his body moved slower now, joints stiff with arthritis from decades of physical labor, but his mind remained sharp as ever. He lived alone in a modest apartment in East Westfield, the historically black section of town that had seen better days. The walls of his small home were covered with photographs, his late wife Esther smiling beside him on their wedding day, their daughter Michelle graduating from college, and old sepia-toned images of his grandparents standing proudly in front of a stretch of farmland that once belonged to them. Walter had been a history teacher before retirement, known throughout the community for his encyclopedic knowledge of local history, particularly the often erased stories of black landowners post-Civil War. His students loved him, but the school administration often found his curriculum too provocative. He kept meticulous records and had a reverence for documentation that his daughter Michelle sometimes teased him about. "Dad and his papers," she would say, rolling her eyes affectionately whenever she visited, and found him hunched over old documents with his magnifying glass. For 3 years, Walter had been piecing together a historical puzzle, spending countless hours at the county records office, tracing property lines and ownership transfers back to Reconstruction. Most people in his apartment building assumed he was simply finding ways to occupy his retirement, but Walter was on a mission, one that had consumed him since discovering his grandfather's journal hidden in the attic of his cousin's home in Georgia. The journal detailed land in Connecticut that had been stolen from their family through forged documents and intimidation tactics common in the Jim Crow era. The morning of October 12th felt different. Walter dressed more carefully than usual, selecting his navy blue suit, worn at the elbows but meticulously pressed, and the red tie his wife had given him on their last anniversary before cancer took her. He placed his most important documents in his father's leather satchel, a bag that had survived decades of use and carried the weight of generational hopes. Before leaving, he looked at his grandfather's photograph and whispered, "Today's the day, Grandpa. Today we set things right." As Walter made his slow journey downtown on the bus, he rehearsed what he would say, knowing from experience that his words would need to be precise and his demeanor perfect. One wrong move, one flash of justifiable anger, and he would be dismissed as just another bitter old man. The stakes were too high for that. The truth had waited too long already. The Morgan Heights Bank stood imposing and sleek on the corner of Main and Prosperity Streets, a 12-story glass and steel monument to wealth that had been constructed just 5 years earlier. The lobby gleamed with marble floors, ornate chandeliers, and a carefully cultivated atmosphere of exclusivity. Behind the customer service counter stood Jessica Whitfield, the regional branch manager, wearing a crisp white blouse and designer skirt, her blonde hair pulled into a tight bun that emphasized her sharp features. Walter pushed through the revolving door at precisely 9:15 a.m., clutching his leather bag close to his chest. He felt immediately out of place as several pairs of eyes turned to assess him. A security guard straightened his posture, watching Walter's movements with undisguised suspicion. 2 young bankers at their desks paused their conversation, exchanging glances as Walter approached the main counter where Jessica was reviewing documents with a colleague. "Good morning," Walter said, his voice steady despite the nervousness he felt. "I'd like to speak with someone about the property this bank is built on." His words came out clear and dignified, though his heart was pounding beneath his suit jacket. Jessica looked up, her professional smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Good morning, sir. Are you interested in our mortgage products? I can have one of our loan officers assist you, though I should inform you that appointments are preferred for such inquiries." Walter shook his head slowly. "No, ma'am. I'm here because this property legally belongs to my family. It was taken unlawfully from my grandfather, Jefferson Green, in 1927. I have the original deed and documentation to prove it." The statement hung in the air for a moment before Jessica's colleague, a red-haired man named Bradley, snorted audibly. Jessica's smile tightened as she regarded Walter with thinly veiled amusement. "Sir, this property was purchased by Morgan Financial Group in 2017 from Commercial Properties Limited, who had owned it since the 1980s. The title is clear." "The title is based on fraudulent transfers," Walter insisted, beginning to open his bag. "If you'll just look at these documents..." "Mr. What was your name again?" Jessica interrupted, not bothering to hide her impatience. "Green. Walter Green. Mr. Green, we're very busy here. If you believe you have some sort of claim, you should take it up with a lawyer, not disrupt our business operations." Her tone had shifted from professional to dismissive, loud enough that other customers had begun to look their way. Walter felt the familiar sting of being treated as invisible, a sensation that had followed him through decades of subtle and not-so-subtle racism. But he had anticipated this reaction. He had prepared for it. Without raising his voice, he continued, "I've already consulted with a lawyer. These documents are authenticated. All I ask is 15 minutes of your time." By now, Bradley was openly smirking, leaning toward another colleague to whisper something that made them both chuckle. The security guard had moved closer, hand resting casually on his belt. Jessica's patronizing smile never wavered as she replied, "Perhaps you should make an appointment. Our legal department would need to be present for such discussions." Walter recognized the tactic, a polite dismissal with no intention of follow-through. His grip tightened on his bag, his knuckles whitening with the effort of maintaining his composure. In that moment, he felt the weight of every dismissal, every door closed in his face throughout his life. And despite his careful planning, despite knowing better, Walter raised his voice just enough to be heard throughout the now quieting lobby. "This land was stolen from my family through forgery and threats of violence. Your bank sits on stolen property, and I can prove it right now." The security guard was now directly behind him. Jessica's smile had disappeared entirely. The atmosphere in the bank lobby had shifted dramatically. Customers were openly staring now, some with concern, others with morbid curiosity. Jessica Whitfield's professional veneer hardened into something colder as she motioned subtly to the security guard, a tall man named Frank Wilson, who had been with the bank for 15 years. "Mr. Green," Jessica said, her voice lowered to avoid further disruption, but edged with unmistakable warning. "I understand you feel strongly about this matter, but causing a scene will not help your case. If you continue to disturb our customers, I'll have no choice but to have you escorted out." Walter felt a large hand rest lightly on his shoulder, not grabbing, not yet, but present enough to convey the threat. He had seen this tactic before, had watched as other black men were removed from establishments for nothing more than standing their ground. His mouth went dry, but he refused to be intimidated. Not today, not with his grandfather's legacy literally in his hands. "I'm not causing a scene," Walter replied evenly, though his heart raced. I'm simply stating facts. This property was part of a 40-acre farm owned by my grandfather Jefferson Green until 1927, when the Westfield Development Corporation falsified transfer documents while threatening my family with violence if they contested it. This isn't just about property, it's about justice. Bradley, the red-haired banker, had pulled out his phone and was discreetly recording the interaction, an amused smirk playing on his lips. Another bank employee, a young black woman named Aisha Johnson, who had recently been hired, watched the scene with visible discomfort, her eyes darting between Walter and her superiors. Jessica maintained eye contact with Walter while reaching for the phone at her desk. I'm calling our legal department now. They can schedule a proper meeting where these claims can be addressed in an appropriate setting. Her tone made it clear she was simply going through motions, humoring what she perceived as the delusions of an old man. Walter recognized the deflection for what it was. He had encountered this strategy countless times during his research. Postponement as a form of denial, banking on the hope that he would give up, or perhaps even pass away before any meaningful action could be taken. The thought strengthened his resolve. There's no need to schedule anything, Walter insisted, finally opening his leather bag. I have everything right here. Court-authenticated documents, historical surveys, the original deed, and a timeline of fraudulent transfers that began when my grandfather was forced off this land. Frank the security guard shifted his weight, moving slightly closer. Jessica placed the phone receiver down without dialing, her patience visibly waning. Mr. Green, even if your documents are what you claim, which I highly doubt, this isn't how property disputes are resolved. You can't simply walk into a bank with old papers and expect us to hand over a multi-million-dollar property. A few customers had begun to record the interaction on their phones, sensing the tension building. Walter was acutely aware of how he might appear to them. An aging black man making outlandish claims, disrupting their morning banking. How easily he could be portrayed as the aggressor in their social media posts, despite being the one seeking justice. I don't expect you to hand anything over, Walter replied, his voice gaining confidence as he extracted a folder of documents from his bag. But I do expect to be treated with respect, and for these documents to be properly reviewed. This isn't just my claim. It's documented history that your institution has chosen to ignore. Jessica glanced at her watch, making her impatience obvious. Sir, we have customers waiting. I cannot tie up our resources on this matter right now. If you leave your contact information, someone from our legal team will reach out to schedule a meeting. Walter knew what that meant. His information would be filed away, perhaps never to be looked at again. He had spent 3 years meticulously building his case, tracing property records, consulting with historians, meeting with legal experts who specialized in historical land claims. He would not be dismissed so easily. With deliberate movements, Walter placed the first document on the counter, a yellowed deed with his grandfather's name clearly visible, dated 1919. This is the original deed, he said, loud enough for those nearby to hear. And this, he continued, placing another document beside it, is the fraudulent transfer document, which a handwriting expert has confirmed was forged. I have their affidavit here as well. Jessica did not even glance at the papers. Mr. Green, please collect your documents and make a proper appointment. The standoff between Walter and Jessica had drawn the attention of everyone in the bank lobby. Customers stood frozen, some openly recording with their phones, while bank employees watched with expressions ranging from amusement to discomfort. The tension hung heavy in the air, almost tangible in the pristine space that suddenly felt too small, too confined. Frank the security guard moved his hand to Walter's elbow, applying gentle but unmistakable pressure. Sir, I'm going to need you to step outside with me now, he said, his voice professionally neutral, but leaving no room for argument. Walter could feel the eyes of everyone on him, judging, assuming, dismissing. It was a familiar feeling, one that had followed him through decades of fighting invisible barriers. Please remove your hand, Walter said quietly, his dignity intact despite the humiliation burning in his chest. I have a right to be here. I have a right to be heard. Jessica nodded to Frank, who tightened his grip slightly. Mr. Green, we've been patient, but you're disrupting our business. Either you leave voluntarily, or we'll be forced to call the police. The mention of police sent a chill down Walter's spine. At 78, he had lived through too many instances where police interactions with black men, regardless of age, had gone terribly wrong. Still, he stood his ground, back straight despite the arthritis that plagued him. Call them, he said, voice steady. I'd appreciate having official witnesses when I present these documents. A commotion near the entrance drew everyone's attention as Catherine Chen, a local reporter for the Westfield Chronicle, walked in with her cameraman. Catherine had been passing by when she noticed people filming through the bank windows. With a journalist's instinct for a developing story, she had decided to investigate. Jessica's expression flashed with alarm before she composed herself. "This is a private matter," she said sharply to Catherine. "There's no story here." Catherine assessed the scene quickly. An elderly black man surrounded by his documents, a security guard with his hand on the man's arm, customers recording with their phones. "It seems the public disagrees," she replied calmly, nodding toward the onlookers with their phones raised. "Would you like to explain what's happening here?" Walter seized the moment. "My name is Walter Green. My grandfather owned the land this bank sits on. It was stolen from him in 1927 through forged documents and threats of violence, a common practice against black landowners in that era. I have proof, but the bank refuses to even look at it." Catherine's eyebrows rose as she signaled her cameraman to start recording. "Those are serious allegations, Mr. Green. May I see these documents?" Before Jessica could intervene, Walter handed over the folder containing his most compelling evidence. The original deed, the forensic analysis of the forged transfer papers, historical photographs of his family on the land, and correspondence from a historical society confirming the boundaries matched current surveys of the bank property. The mood in the bank shifted as Catherine examined the documents with genuine interest. Other customers moved closer, curiosity overcoming their initial judgment. Jessica's professional smile had completely vanished now, replaced by an expression of growing concern as she realized the situation was spiraling beyond her control. "I need everyone who is not conducting official bank business to leave immediately," Jessica announced, her voice sharp. "This includes members of the press. Our security team will escort you out." Catherine looked up from the documents, unfazed. "Actually, I believe this qualifies as a matter of public interest, especially given the historical significance." She turned to Walter. "Mr. Green, would you be willing to discuss your research and these documents in more detail for a story?" For Walter, this moment represented both vindication and risk. Media attention could force the bank to take his claims seriously, but it could also sensationalize his story in ways beyond his control. Still, after years of being ignored, of knocking on doors that remained firmly closed, the opportunity to be heard could not be dismissed. "Yes," he replied, facing Catherine directly. "This isn't just about property. It's about acknowledging historical wrongs and the systematic erasure of black land ownership in America." Jessica quickly picked up her phone. "I'm calling our legal department and corporate communications right now. This matter requires proper channels, not a media circus." By this point, Aisha Johnson, the young black employee who had been watching uncomfortably, stepped forward. "Ms. Whitfield, perhaps we should at least look at Mr. Green's documents. If there's any legitimacy to his claims." Jessica shot Aisha a warning glance that silenced her immediately. "Return to your desk, Ms. Johnson. This is not your concern." The public humiliation of the young woman wasn't lost on the onlookers. Several people exchanged glances, and the mood in the room shifted further against bank management. Walter felt a mixture of emotions: vindication that his claims were finally being taken seriously by someone, sympathy for Aisha who had risked her position to speak up, and apprehension about the confrontation escalating further. As tension continued to build in the bank lobby, an unexpected voice cut through the chaos. "I believe I can help clarify some things here." The deep, authoritative tone belonged to Judge Michael Harrington, a respected figure in Westfield's legal community, who happened to be at the bank that morning for a meeting with financial advisors about the local historical society's endowment fund. Judge Harrington, a 65-year-old white man with silver hair and the gravitas that came with 30 years on the bench, approached the gathering. He nodded respectfully to Walter before turning to Jessica. "Ms. Whitfield, I've known Morgan Heights Bank to pride itself on community relations. Perhaps we can find a more constructive approach to addressing Mr. Green's concerns." Jessica straightened her posture, clearly recognizing the judge and the influence he wielded in the community. "Judge Harrington, with all due respect, this is an internal matter that should be handled through proper legal channels, not in our lobby with press cameras rolling." The judge nodded thoughtfully. "Process matters, certainly, but so does substance." He turned to Walter. "Mr. Green, I believe we've met before. Weren't you the historian who gave that illuminating presentation on Westfield's forgotten Black pioneers at the Historical Society last year? Walter nodded, surprised and somewhat moved that the judge remembered him. Yes, Your Honor. That presentation included some preliminary findings about my grandfather's property. Judge Harrington turned back to Jessica. I found Mr. Green's research methodologically sound and historically valuable. His work has been recognized by serious academics. He gestured to the documents Catherine was still reviewing. Perhaps instead of escalation, we could take 30 minutes in your conference room to review these materials. I'd be happy to offer my perspective, though not in any official capacity. The presence of the judge had shifted the dynamic dramatically. Jessica found herself in a difficult position. Dismissing Walter meant potentially alienating Judge Harrington, whose connections throughout Westfield's elite circles were extensive. The bank's reputation was now at stake in ways she hadn't anticipated when the old black man with a bag had first walked through their doors. After a moment's consideration, Jessica forced a tight smile. Of course, Judge Harrington. We can use the executive conference room. She gestured to Bradley. Please call Mr. Davidson from legal to join us immediately. As they moved toward the conference room, Judge Harrington fell into step beside Walter. In a quiet voice meant only for Walter's ears, he said, I've been following your research with interest, Mr. Green. The systematic dispossession of Black landowners is one of America's unaddressed injustices. Whatever happens here today, your work matters. Walter felt a lump form in his throat. After years of speaking into what felt like a void, being acknowledged by someone with power and influence was overwhelming. Thank you, Your Honor, he managed, his voice slightly husky with emotion. Catherine Chen approached them before they reached the conference room. Judge Harrington, will the press be allowed in this meeting? The public has a right to know about historical land claims that could affect property ownership in our community. Before the judge could respond, Jessica interjected firmly, Absolutely not. This is a preliminary discussion of sensitive documents that may contain confidential information. Judge Harrington gave Catherine a measured look. Perhaps Mr. Green could speak with you after our meeting, once we've had a chance to review his documentation properly. He turned to Walter. Would that work for you? Walter nodded, recognizing the compromise for what it was, an opportunity to have his claims taken seriously, while maintaining some control over how his story would be told. Yes, that would be acceptable. As they entered the sleek conference room with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Westfield, Walter caught a glimpse of his reflection in the glass, an old man in a worn suit, clutching a battered leather bag that contained his family's legacy. But for perhaps the first time in this journey, he wasn't standing alone. Judge Harrington took a seat at the conference table and gestured for Walter to sit beside him. Now, he said, as Jessica and Bradley reluctantly joined them, let's look at these documents with the respect they, and Mr. Green, deserve. The executive conference room of Morgan Heights Bank fell silent as Walter methodically laid out his documents on the polished mahogany table. Present were Walter, Judge Harrington, Jessica Whitfield, Bradley Thompson, and James Davidson, the bank's hastily summoned legal counsel, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who had arrived looking flustered and unprepared. Walter began with the original deed from 1919, preserved in a protective sleeve, a document showing that Jefferson Green had legally purchased 40 acres of farmland, part of which now housed the bank. He then produced county tax records showing his grandfather's consistent payments until 1927, followed by the questionable transfer document to Westfield Development Corporation dated that same year, the signature on which differed markedly from Jefferson Green's verified signatures on other legal documents. As you can see, Walter explained, his voice steady as he pointed to the forensic handwriting analysis he had commissioned. 3 independent experts have confirmed this signature was forged. And here, he produced a yellowed newspaper clipping, is a small notice from the Westfield Gazette, dated 1 week before the so-called sale, reporting that my grandfather had been hospitalized following an unfortunate accident. Family history tells us it was no accident. He was beaten by men who warned him to stop making trouble about the property. James Davidson leaned forward, adjusting his glasses as he examined the documents with growing concern. What had begun as perfunctory professional interest was transforming into genuine alarm as the weight of Walter's evidence became apparent. Mr. Green, Davidson said carefully, these materials are substantial, more comprehensive than anything I would have expected. Why hasn't this claim been formally filed through the courts? Walter's gaze was unwavering. It has, 3 times over the past 40 years. Each time, the case was dismissed on technical grounds without the evidence being fully examined. Once due to statute of limitations, once due to insufficient documentation of continuous claim, and once because the corporate entity that originally took the land no longer existed. His voice carried decades of frustration but remained dignified. The legal system has consistently failed Black Americans seeking restitution for stolen property. That's well-documented history. Judge Harrington nodded solemnly. He's right. The courts have a troubling record on historical property claims, particularly those involving racial injustice. Jessica, who had been silent throughout Walter's presentation, finally spoke. Her voice had lost its dismissive edge, replaced by a professional caution. Even if what you're suggesting about the original acquisition is true, and I'm not conceding that it is, Morgan Heights Bank purchased this property through proper channels, with title insurance and thorough due diligence. We are, legally speaking, innocent purchasers. Innocent? Walter repeated, the word hanging in the air. The documentation of this fraud has been in county records for decades, available to anyone who cared enough to look. Your due diligence conveniently overlooked historical evidence that might have complicated your acquisition. An uncomfortable silence followed. Bradley, who had been smirking throughout most of the morning's events, now looked distinctly uneasy, avoiding eye contact with everyone at the table. James Davidson cleared his throat. Ms. Whitfield, I need to speak with you privately. The gravity in his tone was unmistakable. Jessica nodded stiffly. Let's step outside for a moment. As they left, Walter caught fragments of their urgent, whispered exchange. Potential PR nightmare. Historical injustice narratives in the current climate. Reporter still waiting in the lobby. Left alone with Judge Harrington and Bradley, Walter exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of decades pressing down on him. He looked out the window at the city his grandfather had once owned a piece of, wondering what Jefferson Green would think of this moment. Judge Harrington broke the silence. You've done remarkable work here, Mr. Green. Regardless of the outcome today, you've forced an acknowledgement of history that's been conveniently forgotten for too long. Bradley, still avoiding Walter's eyes, abruptly stood up. Excuse me, he muttered before hurriedly leaving the room. Walter and the judge sat in companionable silence until Jessica and James returned. Something had shifted in Jessica's demeanor. The confident, dismissive bank manager had been replaced by someone more cautious, more measured. Mr. Green, she began, taking her seat. Mr. Davidson has advised me that your documentation merits serious consideration. He believes there are historical irregularities in the property's provenance that warrant further investigation. Walter nodded, saying nothing, allowing the moment to unfold. Jessica continued, clearly choosing her words carefully. The bank, of course, obtained this property in good faith. We were unaware of any historical claims. However, she paused, glancing at Davidson, who gave her an encouraging nod. We also recognize that institutions have a responsibility to address historical injustices when they come to light. Walter's heart began to beat faster, though his expression remained composed. And what does that mean in practical terms, Ms. Whitfield? It means, Davidson interjected, that we'd like to propose forming a joint committee to thoroughly investigate your claim, with the understanding that if your evidence holds up to scrutiny, Morgan Heights is prepared to discuss appropriate remediation. Remediation, Walter repeated, the word falling far short of justice in his mind. My family lost not just land, but generations of wealth accumulation and opportunity. No committee or investigation is needed beyond what I've already provided. The evidence is clear. Judge Harrington leaned forward. Perhaps what's needed is an acknowledgement first, a public recognition of the wrong done to the Green family, followed by good faith negotiations toward meaningful restitution. Jessica hesitated, then nodded slowly. That might be possible. For Walter, this moment represented both victory and compromise. The full justice he sought, the return of his family's land, seemed unlikely. Yet the acknowledgement of his claim, after decades of dismissal, carried a weight of its own. He thought of his grandfather, of his father who had died never seeing this day, and of his daughter Michelle, who had supported his quest despite believing it hopeless. I am willing to meet with your representatives, Walter finally said, provided that the bank issues a public statement acknowledging the historical theft of my grandfather's land and commits to substantive discussions about appropriate compensation. As Jessica nodded her agreement, Walter felt something shift inside him. Not just the vindication of being right, but the deeper satisfaction of having forced a powerful institution to confront a truth it had preferred to ignore. His grandfather's story would no longer be buried in forgotten records. The truth would be known. 3 weeks after the confrontation at Morgan Heights Bank, Walter sat in his small apartment surrounded by newspaper clippings. Catherine Chen's initial article had run on the front page of the Westfield Chronicle, under the headline, "Historical Land Claim Challenges Bank's Property Rights. Elderly Resident Produces Evidence of Stolen Black-Owned Land." The story had been picked up by national outlets, triggering a wave of similar investigations into historical property claims across the country. Walter's phone rang. A call from Michelle, his daughter. "Dad, have you seen CNN? They're discussing your case right now as part of a special on historical land theft from Black Americans." Her voice carried a mixture of pride and disbelief. I always believed you, but I never thought the world would actually listen." "Neither did I," Walter admitted, his voice thick with emotion. For so long, it felt like shouting into the wind. After hanging up, Walter carefully organized the latest batch of correspondence he'd received. Letters from law professors offering pro bono assistance, emails from historical societies requesting copies of his research methodology, and most importantly, the formal letter from Morgan Heights Bank outlining the terms of their proposed settlement. The doorbell rang. Walter opened it to find Aisha Johnson, the young bank employee who had attempted to speak up for him that fateful day. She smiled nervously, holding a small plant in her hands. "Mr. Green, I hope I'm not intruding. I wanted to personally deliver this." She handed him an envelope bearing the bank's logo. Walter invited her in, offering tea which she politely accepted. As she sat on his worn sofa, she looked around at the walls covered with family photographs and historical documents. "You know, I almost got fired for suggesting they look at your documents," she said quietly. "Jessica, Ms. Whitfield, put me on probation. But now, suddenly, I'm on the community relations team they've formed to address historical inequities in lending practices." Walter smiled knowingly. "Funny how that works, isn't it? Yesterday's troublemaker becomes today's diversity initiative when the cameras are rolling." Aisha laughed, then grew serious. "The thing is, Mr. Green, I actually care about this work. My grandparents lost their home in Georgia under similar circumstances. Your courage. It's inspired a lot of us at the bank to push for real change, not just PR moves." Walter nodded thoughtfully as he opened the envelope. Inside was an invitation to a public ceremony where Morgan Heights Bank would formally acknowledge the historical wrong done to the Green family, unveil a permanent exhibit about Jefferson Green and other Black landowners whose property had been illegally seized, and announce the establishment of the Jefferson Green Community Development Fund, with initial capital of $5 million to support Black entrepreneurship in Westfield. "It's not everything," Walter acknowledged, studying the document. "The land itself remains theirs, but this acknowledgement, this fund, it's something my father and grandfather never received, recognition of the wrong done to them." Aisha sipped her tea. "There's more that isn't in that letter. The bank is facing pressure from shareholders now. Some want to offer you a position on the board of directors for the community fund. Others are pushing for financial compensation beyond the fund, direct restitution to your family." Walter set the invitation down carefully. "This was never about money for me," he said, "though justice certainly has a financial component when discussing stolen property." He looked at the photographs of his ancestors on the wall. It was about making sure their story wasn't erased, about forcing this community to acknowledge what happened. Later that evening, as Walter prepared for a meeting with the lawyers who had volunteered to represent him in negotiations with the bank, he received a text message from Judge Harrington. "Historical Society voted unanimously tonight. We're renaming our research center the Jefferson Green Center for Historical Truth and Reconciliation. Would be honored if you'd serve as inaugural director. Your work matters." Walter felt tears welling in his eyes as he carefully took out his grandfather's journal from the leather bag, the very item that had started him on this journey. He opened it to a page he had read countless times. "They may take our land, but they cannot take our dignity or our truth. Someday, someone will listen. Someday, someone will care." "You were right, Grandpa," Walter whispered to the empty room. "It just took a little longer than you thought." 6 months had passed since Walter Green first walked into Morgan Heights Bank with his leather bag full of documents. On a bright spring morning, he stood before a gathered crowd in the plaza outside the bank building, which now featured a bronze plaque detailing the history of the land and Jefferson Green's ownership. Media cameras captured the moment as Walter, dressed in a new suit purchased for the occasion, prepared to address the audience. In the front row sat Michelle and her children, beaming with pride. Beside them was Judge Harrington, who had become both mentor and friend to Walter throughout the negotiations. Aisha Johnson stood with a group of young bank employees wearing pins that read Truth and Reconciliation Committee, an internal group she now chaired with the bank's blessing. Jessica Whitfield was notably absent, having been transferred to another branch following the publicity. Bradley had resigned shortly after the story broke, though rumors suggested his departure wasn't entirely voluntary. James Davidson, the legal counsel who had recognized the validity of Walter's claim, had been promoted to head a new division focused on community relations and historical reconciliation. Walter approached the microphone, feeling the weight of the moment. Behind him stood the bank president, Charles Morgan III, who had flown in from New York specifically for this ceremony. The settlement they had eventually reached wasn't perfect. Walter hadn't reclaimed ownership of the land itself, but it represented an unprecedented acknowledgement of historical wrong and a commitment to meaningful restitution. The Jefferson Green Community Development Fund had been established with $10 million, twice the original amount proposed. Walter and Michelle both held permanent seats on its board of directors. The bank had committed to prioritizing loans to Black-owned businesses in historically redlined neighborhoods. And most meaningfully to Walter, a full scholarship program had been established in Jefferson Green's name at Westfield University, specifically for students studying African American history, law, or urban development. As Walter began to speak, his voice carried clearly across the plaza, strong and dignified. My grandfather, Jefferson Green, once stood on this very soil, not as a visitor or a customer, but as its rightful owner. For nearly a century, that truth was buried beneath layers of forged documents, institutional silence, and the systematic erasure of Black land ownership in America. Today, we unbury that truth. The crowd listened in respectful silence as Walter recounted his family's journey, the land purchase in 1919, the violent theft in 1927, the generations of his family who had carried the story forward, despite being dismissed by those in power. This isn't just about one family or one piece of land, Walter continued. It's about acknowledging a pattern that repeated itself countless times across this nation, a pattern where Black prosperity was seen as a threat rather than a contribution to the community. Charles Morgan III shifted uncomfortably behind Walter, but maintained his composed expression for the cameras. The bank had carefully orchestrated this event as a demonstration of corporate responsibility, though the initial recognition had been forced upon them by Walter's persistence and the public pressure that followed. Some have asked me if I'm satisfied with the resolution we've reached, Walter said, looking directly at the cameras. The truth is, no settlement can fully restore what was taken, not just the land itself, but the generations of opportunity, wealth, and legacy that might have flowed from it. He paused, letting the words sink in. But acknowledgement is the first step toward healing, and the commitments made here today, to education, to community investment, to remembrance, these are meaningful steps forward. From the crowd, someone called out, "Why not give the land back?" The question hung in the air, challenging the narrative of reconciliation that had been carefully constructed. Walter nodded, appreciating the question. That's a fair point. In an ideal world, stolen property would be returned. But we live in a complex reality where perfect justice isn't always possible. What matters most to me is that my grandfather's name and story are no longer buried in forgotten records. His truth is now part of our community's official history. As Walter concluded his remarks, Michelle joined him at the podium, bringing with her a framed photograph of Jefferson Green. Together, they unveiled the permanent historical marker that would stand in the plaza, ensuring that anyone entering Morgan Heights Bank would encounter this piece of history that had nearly been erased. Catherine Chen, who had followed the story from the beginning, approached Walter after the ceremony. "Your story has inspired similar investigations in 12 other cities," she told him. "People are digging through archives, finding documentation of land that was taken from their ancestors. You've started something important." Walter smiled, feeling a deep sense of completion. "I didn't start it," he said quietly. "My grandfather did. When he refused to let go of the truth, I just made sure someone finally listened." Later that evening, as Walter sat in his apartment, the same modest space he'd lived in for years, though he could now afford something more, he carefully placed his grandfather's journal back in the leather bag that had carried it into Morgan Heights Bank that fateful day. Beside it, he placed a copy of the official settlement document, the deed to his grandfather's land, and a flash drive containing digital copies of all his research. Walter planned to donate these materials to the Jefferson Green Center for Historical Truth and Reconciliation, ensuring that the evidence he had gathered would be preserved for future generations. But tonight, he wanted them close to him one last time, these papers that represented not just his personal victory, but a small step toward addressing a historical wrong that had affected countless families like his own. As he closed the bag, Walter felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for years. His grandfather's story had finally been heard. The story of Walter Green and Morgan Heights Bank is more than a tale of personal vindication. It's a powerful reminder of how easily we dismiss people based on appearance, age, or social status. When Walter first entered that gleaming bank lobby, clutching his worn leather bag, he wasn't seen as a man deserving respect or serious consideration. His dignity, his knowledge, his meticulously researched claim, all were initially dismissed with condescending smiles and barely concealed laughter. What changed wasn't just the evidence Walter presented, but the way others chose to see him. Judge Harrington's willingness to look beyond appearances and consider the substance of Walter's claim. Catherine Chen's recognition that this elderly man's story deserved to be heard. Aisha Johnson's courage in speaking up despite the professional risk. Each person who chose to truly see Walter helped shift the balance toward justice. The bank's eventual acknowledgement of historical wrong and commitment to meaningful restitution represents not perfect justice, but progress in a society still struggling to address its legacy of racial injustice. Walter's persistence forced an unwilling institution to confront a truth it had benefited from ignoring, that its prosperity was built, in part, on stolen black wealth and opportunity. How often do we make snap judgments about people based on their appearance, age, or status? The bank employees who laughed at Walter's claim weren't cartoon villains. They were ordinary people making the all-too-common mistake of dismissing someone who didn't fit their image of credibility or importance. Each of us has the power to be like Judge Harrington or Catherine Chen or Aisha Johnson, to resist the easy dismissal, to listen when others aren't, to speak up when silence would be simpler. These small acts of moral courage can help bend the long arc of history toward justice. For those fighting long battles for recognition and restitution, Walter's story offers hope that persistence matters. The truth, carefully documented and bravely presented, has power that transcends immediate rejection. There is value in keeping the record, in preserving the evidence, in refusing to let unjust actions be forgotten. And for institutions built on histories they'd prefer not to examine too closely, Walter's story offers a challenge. Reconciliation begins with acknowledgement. The past cannot be changed, but how we respond to historical wrongs today defines who we are as a society moving forward. Perhaps the most powerful question this story leaves us with is simple. Who are we failing to truly see today? Whose claims are we dismissing because they don't match our expectations of what truth-tellers look like? What stories remain unheard because we've decided before listening that they don't deserve our attention? Remember Walter Green the next time an unexpected voice speaks an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes justice arrives in a worn leather bag, carried by hands that have waited far too long to be acknowledged.